Madam Prime Minister, may I invite you to join us? Deputy Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ingólfur Bjarni Sigfússon. I'm an editor with a public broadcaster here in Iceland, The Roof, and I have the honor of moderating this fireside chat between the two power ladies here sat next to me. Glancing through the headlines this morning was not a happy task. We have 70+ wars. The Washington Post had an in-depth article about the countries which will become more or less inhabitable or are already inhabitable because the median heat is above 37 degrees on more days than it is not. The Economist had a map of the countries most likely to suffer a violent coup in Africa. Spiegel had an article about the number of asylum seekers in Europe reaching already a higher number than in the record year of 2016. I could go on, but it doesn't really look like a planet where peace is realistic. Is it realistic, or is it just something we need to talk about because we should talk about it?
We definitely have to do something about it. Recognizing our realities is really important, but also recognizing the players that need to be brought to the table in a manner that we can cross those bridges, we can bring the connections that are needed for peace to happen. Convening that is becoming more and more difficult. If we look at some of the conflicts that we have today, even some of the big issues around climate, it has been very difficult to bring those players that cause perhaps the most pain into the room. It has been difficult to have a conversation in the United Nations, and as I said, we said that's the global town hall. We're going into echo chambers where we like the sound of our voices, we sympathize and empathize with one another. But the level of the conflict, the level of our lack of investment in climate action that's taking us to a 3-degree world has not allowed us to come and have those conversations. We had conversations in the UN General Assembly. We had a climate ambition summit. And the ambition was met by the smallest of countries. But those countries who are responsible for over 82% of the emissions were not in the room. And when they did come into the room, they were not able to step up to those necessary commitments that they should have made. In the case of conflict, we have to recognize they're very different. The invasion of Ukraine is not the same as an unconstitutional change in West Africa, nor is it one of the aggression that you see in Myanmar against its people. And each one has to be taken where it's at and to be met with the full instruments and the resources that we have. Are we paying enough attention to that? Are we putting those tools on the table and calling for them to be utilized in a fair and a just way? No, if we would stop the wars and we would begin to address that pathway back to peace. So there's a lot for us to do. I'm hopeful because this forum, for one, is happening. And many other fora are beginning to recognize that we have to bring those uncomfortable conversations into one space. If you listen to the conversations that are happening today after the beginning of this horrendous conflict in Israel and Palestine, yes, there are those that are outraged and have very harsh views about what they see should happen, but you also find the voices saying, well, that's not going to get us peace. What we really need to do is to recognize that we did have a pathway to peace and to a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. We need to get back to that discussion. And there needs to be a little bit more, I would say, honesty, integrity in these discussions that we're having. Courage to speak about perhaps what people think is sensitive or unspeakable or the elephant in the room. We do have to be far more pragmatic.
But I think, if I might add, that what Amina said about the echo chambers of the world, because even here in Iceland we have several echo chambers, groups that really don't understand each other in their own echo chambers. So think about the globe and all its echo chambers. And I think what we've been seeing in the last few years is really also the effect of increased polarization, not just within countries, but also between countries. So I think actually, because I was there in Paris 2016 when all of us felt so optimistic about what we were going to do in the climate crisis, And then we have seen really the struggle ever since to really make things happen, and not least when it comes to financing the actions. So I think and hope, because the Climate Ambition Summit, it was a good summit, even though we did not have the bigger nations. But I do hope that the smaller nations can also push the big ones to more action when it comes to fighting the climate crisis, because that is also going to be a very huge factor in, promoting conflicts around the world.
One of the trends that we see is a erosion of democracy. Recent surveys have shown that, especially among younger people, apparently they have less faith, or at least consider democracy to be less of an important thing to consider. We see strongmen and populists gaining power all over the world, perhaps because they don't sit in fora like this, they just take action and do stuff. That is a challenge, certainly to the multilateral system. How do we tackle, how do those who believe in multilateral solution and democracy tackle that and provide results? If we start with you.
Well, I think we have to go back to basics. Governance in any country should be about that social contract between the people, those that are governed and those that are governing them, leaders. Leaders that understand that their first responsibility is to the rights of their people. We use democracy as a framing for how to get that done. Three powerful parts, three pillars of it, where institutions are important, parliaments are important, justice is important. And there's not been the investment we should have had in those institutions that would then carry a process that includes and delivers results in people's lives. That erosion, I think, is the result that you see in those that vote are not young people. They don't believe in this governance. The social contract is being torn. It is being undermined. Sadly, it's across the world. So those that have promoted democracy, and it has worked for them for a time, are suddenly also finding it fracturing. So it's not democracy from my humble point of view that is the problem. The problem is the model and how we exercise leadership in providing democracy. In some cases, as we see when I look at my continent and I see the unconstitutional changes, much of that is in response to an environment where people see that they need to bring back to themselves a sense of discipline, safety, security, and then they go back, to celebrate the military. I mean, that has to tell you that something is very wrong with the governance system in those countries. And it is a wake-up call. There are discussions and debates right now about what is causing this. I think everyone agrees that they want to go back to constitutional laws that protect the rights of people and deliver. But that journey back is going to take considerable work. I think today too that, with technology, it is far more difficult to get through a democratic process, an election, with what technology does to undermine that. It's a fantastic opportunity to be connected, but we see the abuse of technology in elections, in eroding the trust of those that are governing and those that are governed. So there's a lot of work to do. I hope that what we can do is involve young people in how we reframe this, because I think we do have to have that discussion. It's going to be about their future now, and we have to explain. It's very difficult to explain some leadership today, that a democratic process put in place what is clearly not the leader of the people. This disconnect is something that we have to get back to, and we have to have discussions country by country, across regions, the power of the convening of the UN to still bring us back to the core of the values that we have in the Charter.
But I think also we cannot talk about democracy without talking about the other factors that go with democracy. And then I'm talking about human rights, for example, talking about equality. I'm talking really about the framework that the world has united around in the SDGs, where we think about the welfare of the people, where we have that clear goal of not leaving anyone behind. Because if you live in a world where you don't have equality, where you don't experience that people enjoy general human rights, it's very difficult to talk about democracy. So I think we need to have this holistic picture when we talk about democracy. And I agree, there is a growing audience for the strong men who simply say, get things done. But I think also that we will see the pendulum swing, because with democracy we have those rights, those freedoms, which we have seen actually taken away from people just overnight, but which is really the groundwork for a good society. Now, Iceland has focused a lot on democracy. We did that during our chairmanship in the Council of Europe earlier this year. Democracy, human rights, and the international order. And I think, as I said in my speech here before, for a small country, I think we really realize the value of those important things and the context in which they are all bound. And then at one point on technology. With AI and new technologies and digitalization of really the political debate, we are seeing not just, I think we could say it's one of the biggest changes we have seen in political debate for centuries. Because things move in such so fast that it is really difficult to have an in-depth discussion these days when technology controls really so much of the debate. You know, medium is the message, was said one, and we might think about that these days.
You've addressed the weakness of the multilateral system and the institutions that make up the multilateral system. And okay, so those need to be reformed. But how do you do that under these circumstances? How do you reform a system that needs to be active right now? How do you deliver results to people in conflict zones who are suffering the consequences of climate change, who are scared and hungry and don't have a lot of time for debate and process? How do you meld those two things so they work? Maybe you start with Katrín now.
Well, I mentioned the Council of Europe. Obviously, that is a smaller body than the UN. so I must admire what Amina and her colleagues are doing every day at the UN with the whole world at the table. But the Council of Europe, I thought it was actually a very important project for Iceland, because we were dealing with very serious issues. And then I'm talking about the invasion of Russia into Ukraine and the result of that summit that was held here in Reykjavik, which is the Registry of Damages, damage done by Russia and Ukraine, which is about accountability and the fact that if you actually violate sovereignty and territorial integrity, you have to be held accountable. And I think we have some examples of multilateral collaboration where we actually see that things can happen. I mentioned the Paris Agreement, which inspired optimism around the world. Obviously, I think it's very important what will happen next, not just at the COP this December. Maybe the good thing there is that everybody's so pessimistic that something actually good might come out of it. But we also have the Summit of the Future next year, and I think that is going to be a very important summit for the globe, because there we will really take a stand to where we want to move on.
How do you reform a multilateral institution, especially if it involves some of those pillars of those institutions having to give up power because the world has changed?
Well, power's never given up, right? You will have to negotiate it, negotiate those spaces to say that we will be in a better world if we concede some of that power for the greater good of all. You've got to find a vested interest in doing that. And I think that we have to put on front, at the core of it, yes, our human rights and the rule of law, but accountability, and there have to be checks and balances, that you are held to account, that you cannot get away with the kind of atrocities that we've seen people get away with nothing to account for. And then to see the double standards, that where you're able to get accountability, you exact the maximum accountability response there. And then in others, you get away with it. So the world starts to become more fractured in doing so. And I think that has to come back. We need to have common ground where we all agree. And it's there. I don't think that it's not there, but we have to reinforce that and come back to have those conversations. But I do think that this is not a question of human rights and women's rights. It's a question of common sense that you need the other half of the world at the table. And without women's leadership, this is just unusual that we sit on this stage. On most stages, it's just men. It's still just men, doesn't matter where you go in the world. We looked at many of those panels that we saw in the United Nations. And it wasn't because we didn't try to get a women and man panel, it was because voted into office, voted into a boardroom were men, and there were no women at the table. Women bring value. They don't take away your jobs or your space, but they bring something else in there that perhaps is a reason why when people say a man-made climate event, you need to underscore the man, because in the decision-making of fossil fuel companies, of the way in which we consume and that we produce, most of these decisions are made by men. And if you bring women into this, you will have a decision that will look at the whole community, as we look at the whole family. I mean, we're wired differently, but together we will go further. If we look at the war in Ukraine, we are speaking about winning the war. But where are the conversations about the pathways to peace? And where are the women at the table that are having those discussions with the men? And we're not saying exclude, we're saying bring those voices in. So I think women's leadership is more than ticking a box. It is results. I don't know yet a woman leader that has not delivered on results. And if it's that they deliver less, I'm not sure that men don't do worse, because in many of the cases, we would not be in the position that we are in. And so we have to take a hard look at what are the barriers for allowing, that prevent women from coming into those spaces, and to have a better conversation with men. I mean, I also think that we feminists often have conversations in our own echo chamber, because we've assumed through various academic work and research where men are on all of this. But I think we need to have a better human conversation where men and women and the intergenerational piece comes in. Because if I look to see how we speak about the future, there's not much of the future who will take those leadership roles there. And so
I think there actually were fewer women leaders at the UN General Assembly this year than last year. So it's not just that we are moving backwards on whole when it comes to the SDG on gender equality. I think we see it also in the leadership roles. And it's just crazy. It is, because we should have thought when it's 2023 that we would be there. But now that it's nearly 300 years estimated until we get full gender equality in the world. So all of us will be dead then, and probably all our children too.
We have to want to see it.
And probably the grandchildren too. So it's quite a long wait for half of humanity.
We have to want to see at the table those that can bring solutions, regardless of what gender they are.
Exactly.
And I think that if we do that, we will see, women and men at the table. We've seen this today in my country that's pretty conservative in many parts of it, Nigeria. You'll hear men saying that women deliver better. My daughters are doing better. Because they were given that chance, or they will point to myself and say, well, you see, this is what happens when you put a woman in decision making. So I think we also need the men to look around and see the value. You need to see us, you need to hear us, and you need to value us. And that doesn't matter whether in the boardroom, in a multilateral setting, even in a situation of conflict, of war. See us, and we take the brunt of it. Wars may be over, and we may lose our men in these wars. We lose women as well. But the scars of wars that live with women, that live with children, that live with some men, they go on for a lifetime. And so we need to be at that table to redefine what we mean by attaining peace. And at what cost? At what cost do we attain that peace?
You gave me the keyword intergenerational. We have some questions. We want to take some questions from the room. before any of you raise your hands, we've actually picked out the people to ask them. Because we want
Very democratic.
Very democratic, because we want to give voice to young people and get questions from some of the younger members of the audience. So let me start by mentioning Anne Elizabeth Jensdóttir. Where are you? And there should be a microphone for you.
Here it is.
Yes?
Is it on?
We need to, there's no sound. So.
It's not on? Is it? Yes,
No,
it
it's on.
is. Thank you so much for passing me the floor. I have a somewhat sensitive but also important question to you. Western countries, such as the Nordic countries, have a long history of imposing their views and way of life on the global south. Sometimes with the best of intentions, sometimes with the worst. Nonetheless, the consequences have often been devastating. How do we ensure that the Nordic countries' development aid policies don't become a continuation of colonialism by other means?
Well, that's an easy question. Where do we start with that? Katrín, do you want to?
Well, I think it is really a complicated question and it's no simple answer. And if we take an example from Iceland, where we have, because we were talking about gender equality, we have focused on gender equality in our developmental collaboration. Obviously, that is a value that we value very greatly, but we also firmly believe that it is a universal human right that should apply everywhere. So I think when dealing with that, so we are not actually continuing to acting in the same way as was done in the 19th century, really. I think we have to value all the different factors, because obviously these trends can be found in development collaboration, that Western values are imposed on the global south. But we also must think about which values is something that the world has actually united around. And therefore, I talk a lot about the SDGs because I firmly believe that they are not part of imposing values. Those are the values that we have actually united around as a world. So I think, therefore, that is a pact that I truly believe that should be our guiding lines, not just in development collaboration, but in everything we're doing. I know they are abstract and people find them very distant. And they say, what does it matter to us in Iceland, what the SDGs are all about, But it's really because it's one humankind. And even though we're at a different place, I think we all can find it very useful to use those goals as a guiding light for what we're doing. But I think it's a sensitive question, and I think you probably could find some examples about Western values being imposed upon the global south during this, through development collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Oof, okay, so coming from a colonized nation, I think that it's very important we remember history. In trying to accommodate those core values, we did have, and still have, the Charter of Human Rights.
Yeah.
I think it's well to remember that many countries were still colonized when the declaration was signed. And that as we have progressed, do we own it? And I think we do, but perhaps it's not apparent. And we own it in our constitutions. So I think when you come into a conversation with developed and developing countries, important to make the emphasis of one's constitution, and so that your human rights are right in front of you in your countries with leaders that need to deliver them, and that the Charter in Geneva is the benchmark of where the world comes together and agrees we're one, and we're one on a set of core values. I think over the years, probably those core values, as different countries have had the ability to develop, we have layered more and more and more. We lost the core. We left people behind in traveling on some of those core values and rights for women, gender, and so now we see the tensions. It is a complex question to answer. You can't answer it one way. And I think that today, when we have those conversations, the rights that we hold on to are indivisible. But there's also something that we said about them, they're progressive. So they're journeys that we need to take with people, with countries. And I think where you have had that experience of getting to the top, then you need to bring people along. And in bringing people along, you don't drag them. You don't force people, because you might get them to the destination and then you'll regress and wonder why, the next day you can't get agreement and you've gone back and you'll say we've lost ground on rights. Well, you never had them. So it's really important to embrace them. There's a lot of unconscious bias. And so we find that on different levels. Even today, when I'm sitting at the table and I'm chairing a meeting, the unconscious bias at the table says that what is this woman first, and woman from the South doing at the head of this table with many other men and women from the North? And you suddenly see a conversation happening in front of you without you. You have to say, hello, DSG, the Deputy Secretary General, it's me. And it's not that it's deliberate. You just said unintentional. It is unintentional, but it has to be called out so that we can right those wrongs. The same happens with our education system. Our education system is one that has been colonized. It is an education system that's not grown from inside of countries, that's taken the value of religion, of traditions, of culture. Not all culture and traditions are bad. That you may not agree with them, but you've got to travel with people through all of this. And if I use two extremes where we have extreme views on them from developed and developing countries, I'll take polygamy. We have laws, and it works for many countries in the developing world. We've not got to a stage where we will say, no, it's a monogamous marriage that we want, or a partnership that we want. And so people need to understand how that works. And that why are younger people today in many of our countries saying, well, that's what we prefer? Do they have agency to project that and to protect that because that is their way? Or you have the LGBTQI communities for many countries who have not been able to digest that. And are they right, are they wrong? We have to travel till we get to where this diversity that we have in our world today is that fabric with threads that are also important and that are the strength that we must embrace. So I think we still have a way to go on anything, but can you open up the space to have that discussion? It is uncomfortable. We should be able to agree to disagree. And on the things that do harm, we have to come together to deal with those and find the solutions for it. I have a lot of hope because I see in many discussions where we've been courageous enough to bring difficult issues to the table that we've been able to have conclusions that have actually seen champions come from where you least expect it to push those issues because there are better understanding. There is more empathy with what the sufferings of people are as a result of those rights being denied. And it's not always a question that we're apparent about. And I think this is where the echo chambers, we need to come out of them. Technology, again, how can we have a conversation that is more inclusive? How can we find solutions to these that everyone can live with? That's a world where there is solidarity in looking for the dignity in life. Everybody must be dignified. Their ways of life. Just hearing about, I'm from a herder family. So herders and farmers, it is the root cause of it is our inability to have recognized that urbanization happens and that with that more food is needed. And with that, you need to go back to these two important communities that actually have a symbiotic relationship to see how do we work out the land issue, the grazing issue, the livelihoods. How do we move a generation of herders into ranching? How do we look at farmers who will see the value of their compatriots as they've worked out in life? This is difficult. And when it's not attended to, you will have conflict. It may be exacerbated by climate change, but ultimately it is a lack of leadership to provide the space for both urbanization to happen, food to be provided, and people's lives and livelihoods to be honored.
Thank you. We have another question from Joshua Gabriel Davidsson, who is the Icelandic representative to the UNR.
Thank you. So although we might pass laws, human rights laws, with the best of intention, they might not always have the effect that we imagined and can sometimes even backfire. And sometimes we can also see some fluctuations in cultures. For example, you can see some conflict bubbling up with the LGBTQIA here in Iceland, for example, and also overnight in, for example, Israel-Palestine conflict now in Gaza over the weekend. So what are the major challenges that hinder the effectiveness of human rights laws, and what are ways of overcoming these and these fluctuations that we see?
I think first things first, you have to respect the rights of everyone, recognize them, include them, and we have to have these conversations from the lowest level of our existence, which is in your family, in your community, in your society. Having this top-down doesn't work. The conversations that are happening now on Israel and Palestine is that, you know, we have to remember every life is valuable. And if we do that and we start from that point, we begin to look for the solutions to protect those lives and to stop the consequences of two sides that look not to find the solutions. Again, it's about leadership, but leadership doesn't have to start from the top down. It should, but, you know, we can change that from within. And you know, that voice needs to count. It is going back to why would Iceland's voice count when perhaps the prevailing leadership is in the P5? Well, once you bring your voice to the table on what is right, and you gain a momentum around that right, then you for sure will see that bigger powers begin to buckle. And we've seen that on climate. We've seen that from Barbados, that argued the financial consequences of excluding small nations and bring some of those clauses to the fore that were approved by the IMF, and now see the protection of those nations through climate justice. So you do have voices that can start from the very smallest space into the arena where rights are abused, where people's lives are taken for granted. But it is so important. Recognize people's views. As I say, we may disagree with many of them, but if we hear them and engage them, you can begin to have a conversation. I walked into Afghanistan for one reason alone: let's not forget about the women and girls of Afghanistan. I was not going to win, you know, Hayatollah in Kandahar saying he's reversing everything because Amina Mohammed landed in Afghanistan. But what we did was to amplify the voices of the women there. They don't want us to make up their voices, they just want us to amplify them and to have robust discussions with the leadership of the Taliban, in which I could remind them that there are laws within the Quran, within the Hadith, that they are trampling over. And today we are still open in that discussion. We will have a debate on women in Islam in the next 2 weeks. So I think that you have to hang on to the rights and the truth and your convictions and keep pushing until they're achieved. We are in a world where the realities are pretty miserable, but the aspirations of all those instruments we put there, I think Karen just said this, on the SDGs, are amazing. So we need to want to achieve them and not to reinvent them. They're there, but let's try to close the gap between what is and what should be.
But it's so odd, really, because if you think about the progress, you know, because obviously loads of progress have been made in the world for the last 100 years, even though we started this morning a little bit bleakly. You know, if we think about it, so much has happened. And how has that happened? It has happened through dialogue. And therefore, you sometimes wonder, why do not everybody see this? Why do not everybody realize that real progress is only made through dialogue and respectful dialogue, and try to create understanding, because in the end, it's all about humans. And they are, of course, different, but still very much the same. So I think if we really think about what has worked, dialogue is the tool that has worked. Amina mentioned small countries, and they have done an amazing, really, job in really raising their flag when it comes to climate action. And I admire not least the small island states that have raised that flag and spoken very loudly and actually made some very important changes through their through what they have been saying. And the same can also be said about the people living around the Arctic, because we're going to talk about the Arctic here in this house in just a few days' time at the Arctic Circle. And I think always the most important people there at that conference are the people who are actually living around the Arctic. And they have been saying, all very good that you are talking about the Arctic and the opportunities that are there, but we want to be there to talk about it. So I think when you really are pessimistic, you also must remember that progress has truly been made, and dialogue has always been the tool which has made that progress.
That light, that tower, that light that we see there is hope. Mm. I mean, it's the one commodity that the UN has, and that's the one we propagate. Because without it, then why are we sitting in this room? Mm-hmm. We must remain hopeful. The fact that both of us women are sitting on this stage is hopeful. Because from us, you know, hopefully many more women will stand on our shoulders, and they will be more women and more leaders that are women like yourself, for which we're incredibly proud.
Well, I think that's a good note to stop on. I know we have to come to a hard stop because you're both very busy and have to be somewhere entirely else in about 10 minutes' time. But it's also good to end on a slightly more optimistic note than we started at. I guess that's as good as we'll get today. I want to thank my distinguished panelists, Katrín, Jakobsdóttir, Amina, Mohammed. Let's give them both a...
To be continued. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.